The bridge has a name the maps have forgotten. Locals still whisper it when the October wind scours the river stones. Ravens Hollow Bridge. It stands 3 miles downstream from the mill town of Ashcombe, in the shadow of a scrub of pines and the collapsed chimneys of houses that were empty before the war took their men. On a brittle morning, October 12, 1927, a mason named Elias Crow fell from its eastern span and was swallowed by the shallows. The coroner's ledger records a simple verdict: misadventure. The ledger is wrong. I first found Ravens Hollow by way of an old railway timetable I bought in a second-hand bookshop on Summer Street, Boston. A ragged page tucked in a volume of maritime law. The timetable listed a halt at Ashcombe, Ravens Hollow, an asterisk beside the name. Beside the asterisk, in a pencil almost worn to nothing, someone had written, "Do not trust the bridge." The proprietor shrugged when I asked, as if the inscription were a child's nonsense. He did not know Elias Crow. Neither did the official histories. But Ashcombe remembers in quieter ways. At the town library, under shelves half cleared by moth, I unearthed a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth. They were written by a woman named Margaret Hale, who kept a boarding house for laborers between 1924 and 1933. Her handwriting is small and severe. She mentioned men who came in the dead of night with brass cases and faces covered. She described ledger entries in a ledger that was never the town's ledger. She wrote of children with white hair and no names who waited on the bridge and sang while the men below hammered and lit strange fires. Margaret's last letter, dated November 2, 1933, ends with a sentence cut by a jagged tear. "They bury what they cannot take home. If you come, do not." When I walked the lane toward the bridge, the locals pretended not to see me. A woman at the general store, a daughter of a man who once worked at Kestrel Works, slid a bar of soap across the counter and pressed in a voice like a closed door the single sentence, "Never go beneath the western arch." Later I would learn why her father swore he never looked under that arch again. He said the water spoke in names, and the names were not his own. Ravens Hollow Bridge is older than the town. Built in 1881 by the Ashcombe Foundry and contracted to the Kestrel Road Company, its iron ribs cross the yawning river like the ribs of some fossilized leviathan. Walk its length in fog, and one can still see the scorch marks on the eastern pillar where someone set a brazier centuries ago. There are places where the mortar is blackened, and small triangular scorch etchings have been hammered into the stone. I counted them. 13 marks beneath the eastern face, and a fourth, deeper cut that runs into a seam beneath the foundation, as if hands had dug and then been choked by the river. The first time I slipped a crowbar into that seam, the world narrowed to the rasp of iron. Under a lattice of silt and root, I struck iron, not the bridge's iron, but hinges, a trap. When I levered the plate aside, a hollow exhalation of cold water and old air rose up, and from that darkness came the smell of copper, soap, and a child's laughter muffled like a bell under cloth. What I discovered first was not bones, but objects, tiny carved wooden toys, a rosary of black beads, a child's pinafore turned to paper-thin lace, and a ledger bound in cracked leather. The ledger had belonged by the names inside to a man called M. Hargrove, Mason Hargrove, foreman, contractor to Kestrel Works. His entries began with banal notations: 10:02, 1926, shipment of girders, men, J. Kemp, S. Noble. But the entries grew stranger. Names were crossed out and annotated with times of night. There were columns labeled not for weight, but for quietus, containment, and disposition. On March 3, 1927, a single line reads, "One infant taken.
Masked custodians present. Ledger paid in full. I kept the ledger hidden at first, knowing that by touching its pages I had entered a jurisdiction of danger the town's 2 remaining constables preferred to ignore. But paper keeps secrets the way river stones keep cold. Someone in Ashcombe knew I had looked. That night, or perhaps the next, for fear blurs hours, a pair of footsteps came to the foot of my rented room. The knocks were careful, the sort that come from someone with knowledge of how houses are built. The voice that followed was soft, but the words were iron. Return what you have taken. No name, no law, only that precise, impossible command. In the months that followed, I learned the bridge's terrible history. Kestrel Works had not merely been a foundry. Behind its shutters and railings, it had been a cold repository for experiments of a sort not kept in university ledgers. Letters from a scientist at Kestrel, a Dr. Rufus Bell, which I found filed under private in the county archive, speak of attenuated cognition and preservation of the uncompleted. There are diagrams. There are lists of names. At the core of their work, they sought to trap the residue of grief, the thing left when a life is unmade, and to harness it. They employed midwives, charlatans, and men in masks who promised the bereaved a last peculiar duty, to hand them something that could not be cared for in the light of day. The bridge, it turned out, was not built to span water, but to seal. Its arches hide chambers, and its buttresses conceal shafts that lead to a subterranean vault a dozen feet beneath the riverbed. There, in cold air that tastes like old coin, Kestrel's custodians stored what they could not bury, echoes with teeth. Margaret's letters hinted as much. Her last entry described children placed like candles in a stone room lit by iron lamps. They were not alive in the ordinary sense. They did not breathe. They listened. One November evening, guided by the ledger and Margaret's hand-drawn map, I descended the shaft beneath the western arch. The river grumbled above. Sunlight from a slit of water made a pale ribbon on the vault's floor. The chamber had been carved with care. On a dais lay 6 small forms, wrapped in oilcloth, and around them, scattered like offerings, were toys, coins, and the rusted teeth of old keys. There were masks, too, leather, painted with spirals, and a note pinned to one with a rusted nail. Custodial inventory. Do not remove. The note bore a signature I did not expect. Elias Crow. Elias had been more than a mason. He had been the rope that bound the city's secrets. His handwriting, the ledger, Dr. Bell's notes, they coalesced into a picture of a man who had traded complicity for survival. He had supervised deliveries, counted small things into crates, and on a night in October he had been held over the river by men who wanted to be sure he would hold his tongue. They did not let him live. As I lifted one of the wrappings, certain that I would reveal an infant skull or a fragment of bone, I found instead a childlike face of wood, carved, painted, impossible. The pupils were pinholes drilled to receive light. As I set it down, something rang from the far corner of the chamber, a clockwork note, slow as a heart. A child's lullaby, not from any tongue I knew, but archaic, like speech from a place of wells, unfurled, and with it the sense of being observed by scores of patient, immaterial eyes. Mask-clad men began to appear in Ashcombe those weeks, always at twilight. They spoke in flat syllables, paid with heavy coins, and asked locals if any outsider had been meddling. The old men sat silent by their doors. The priest prayed, in a voice that cracked near the end. Once beneath a sky of slate, I was followed across the mill pond by a small boy in a yellow cap, who said, without turning, "They like questions. They like being named. When I asked him what he meant, he lifted a hand that was powder cold and traced the bridge with that hand as if drawing a map. They sleep under there. And his breath steamed in the air like an accusation. The ledger's last pages are the worst. They fold the same way executions fold, efficient, practical, and without regret. On October 12, 1927, Mason Hargrove wrote in a hand that trembles but does not break, "Elias failed to contain. Water took him. No witnesses. Seal West Vault. Custodians satisfied." Then beneath a different ink and in a different hand, a single line. One remain. Name recorded. There is no name beside it.